U.S. Steel had people worried about their jobs, and understandably so. They spent a lot of money trying to brainwash everybody into thinking this is good.
That's from the inaugural episode of the Labor Notes podcast, which just launched yesterday. When Nippon sought to acquire U.S. Steel in a $15 billion acquisition last year, the companies went to great lengths to convince U.S. Steel workers that the deal would benefit them too, and not just line executives' pockets. We'll hear why the workers didn't buy it.
I don't think it's a stretch for anyone to kind of imagine that these companies see people as just the material that they're printed on, essentially. That they have, and their position is that they have the right to do whatever they want with it.
Then, from the Third and Fairfax podcast, a report on the SAG-AFTRA video game strike.
We want to make sure that the sort of intimidation and retaliation workers like Brother Phil faced just stop on the railroad, and then stop for every worker, because we all deserve quality of life and dignity at work.
Justice for Phil on the Speaking of Work podcast.
All of these social media platforms have cut the cord, as it were, or sort of short-circuited things, where there's now just like a fucking direct pipeline from someone on a social media website to a politician.
On the Dig podcast, TrueAnon host Brace Belden and Liz Franczak on our freakish and reactionary tech oligarchy. They say Musk and friends built a technological infrastructure that's warped everyone's minds, including their own. Now they're seizing the state.
I don't know in other languages if they refer to this idea of a final conflict, but I know that they do in Spanish, where they call it the lucha final. Agrupémonos todos en la lucha final.
The Workers' Beat wonders, is this the end of capitalism?
In a perfect world, if you have 1,000 people who we're bargaining a contract for, we'd have all 1,000 people at the table, but that's not practical. We have to have a representation of that bargaining unit that fairly represents everybody.
And the UFCW 3000 Union podcast is back with a report on working with rank-and-file members in contract bargaining.
They pick up a candidate. This product's from South Africa, isn't it? Well, yes, it is. Well, it looks like all of this is from South Africa. And then somebody would shout, have you checked your shopping carts? A lot of this stuff is from South Africa. And people would say, oh my God, this is terrible. And everybody walk out leaving 30, 40 shopping carts filled to the brim.
In our final segment, On the Line Stories of BC Workers remembers union solidarity against apartheid in South Africa. I'm Chris Garlock, and that's all coming up on this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. We'll get started, as we do every week, with Harold's quick rundown of shows you should know.
Thanks, Chris. Social media guy Harold Phillips here again, folks. And you know, when I do our Shows You Should Know segment, I tend to focus on the podcasts that are part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. But remember, it's the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Every day across the country and in many places around the world, there are labor and worker-oriented radio shows that are going out live over the air and streaming on the internet. This week we thought we'd put the focus on them. So, here's some radio shows you should know for the week of March 9th. The Scallywags and Sooks discuss a big win for reinstated workers at Australian wind farms and share an industry update on Concrete Gang. Ken, Ed, and Phil chat with Jim Sweeney and Jeff Horn about the recent neutrality agreement Local 150 signed with Uber and the Working Families Archer Avenue St. Patrick's Day Parade on The Workers' Mic. Jacob and Adam talk with Charles Connoisseur about being a union ironworker, react to some backtracking from the Trump administration, and take calls on the Valley Labor Report. What's Going On Labor Monday looks at UAW 9A telling its members not to back Eric Adams or Andrew Cuomo for mayor of New York City, and a grassroots movement taking aim at Formosa Plastics. one of the world's worst environmental bad actors. Hey, while we're in New York, I just can't resist throwing at least one podcast in here. New York State Department of Labor Commissioner Roberta Reardon discusses the key workforce elements in the governor's budget proposal, including worker protections, investments in childcare, workforce training initiatives, and more on Union Strong. And one last podcast that kind of covers all the bases. Bob and Scott talk with Project Censored director Mickey Huff about the current state of the media on the Green and Red podcast. So, all these radio shows are going out live, over the air, and streaming on the internet. How do you know when to listen to them? Well, I've got a tip. Go to laborradionetwork.org and click on the calendar item in the menu at the top of the page. You'll see a calendar that lists all the air times of the radio shows that are part of the network. And as an extra special bonus, if you follow us at Labor Radio Net on Blue Sky and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, you'll see notifications of when the latest episode of these radio shows is going to go out live over the air and on the internet. I know, radio sounds kind of old-fashioned. But here's the deal. A lot of people still listen to it. And a lot of producers are reaching out to those people and making sure that labor's message is heard. Do yourself a favor and tune in to one of these shows or one of the other radio shows that we have listed at laborradionetwork.org. Back to you, Chris. And I'm looking forward to listening to your live show, The Labor Heritage Power Hour, when it broadcasts on Thursdays.
Aw, thanks for the shout-out, Harold. Much appreciated, brother. Now, here's this week's show. Enjoy.
U.S. Steel had people worried about their jobs, and understandably so. They spent a lot of money trying to brainwash everybody into thinking this is good.
Welcome to the first episode of the Labor Notes podcast, a new show from the folks who put on the Labor Notes conference every 2 years. We'll be talking each week about the strikes, contract campaigns, shop floor actions, reform caucus organizing, and union elections that our staff and rank-and-file workers in the labor movement's troublemaking wing write about all year long. We'll also share strategies for stewards, contract action team members, grievance committee members, and really anyone organizing in their workplace. The quote we heard at the start of this episode was from Don Furco, former president of the United Steelworkers Local 1557 in Pennsylvania, who spoke to Labor Notes editor Jenny Brown last month about the Japanese steel manufacturer Nippon's blocked attempt to buy U.S. steel. Jenny's piece, Blocked Nippon Deal is Lesson on Tariffs, Workers Need a Say, ran on our site on February 18th. You can read it at labornotes.org.
We have Jenny Brown, who reported this story, here with us today. Welcome, Jenny.
It's great to be here.
Jenny, a lot of mainstream coverage has been portraying this deal as a net good for U.S. steelworkers. Why do you think that is, and what's missing from that perspective?
Well, what's missing is that what U.S. Steel employees, the rank-and-file members in the union, actually think about it and why. The basic story is that last year Nippon Steel tried to buy U.S. Steel for $15 billion, but government regulators blocked the deal in January. And the cabinet officials that were tasked with reviewing the deal, they extracted some pledges from Nippon, but it wasn't really enough. And so they deadlocked 3-3, and the decision fell to President Biden, who then blocked the deal. And what I found interesting was that the companies spent tens of millions of dollars trying to sell the deal to the members of the United Steelworkers, especially those who work at 3 really huge facilities in the Mon Valley.
Where did United Steelworker members actually land on all this?
Well, the union officially opposed the deal, and so did most members. But the business press really portrayed this as a disagreement between quote-unquote union bosses and the rank and file, which is really far from the truth. Both the companies were really giving U.S. Steel employees a hard sell. it wasn't really working to convince very many workers. And Don Furco, the local 1557 president that we quoted at the top, said that that's when the company's tactic switched to threats. Like U.S. Steel said they would start shutting down facilities in the Mon Valley, which is southeast of Pittsburgh. And they even threatened to move the work to non-union facilities, which the union charges is illegal, an illegal anti-union measure. So that was the situation.
Jenny, you mentioned that part of what was maybe distorting workers' actual impressions of the deal in a lot of coverage was the fact that their dissent wasn't being quoted as much, while supportive voices were being elevated. How did you find workers who had more of a finger on the pulse of what their coworkers actually thought? And what did you learn from those conversations?
Well, actually, it was really easy to reach people, and they were eager to talk. So I think the distortions came from company pressures on mainstream journalists and outlets. Other reporters even talked to the same workers I talked to in some cases, but the workers they interviewed told me they weren't quoted, or they were just the one anti-deal voice among a chorus of people being quoted to back the deal. And in particular, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where workers have been on strike since October of 2022, sent a scab reporter who was basically a mouthpiece for the companies. And some workers refused to talk to him, of course. So I think basically this is a problem of the mainstream media being influenced by all of this money and propaganda that the companies were producing.
Thank you, Jenny, for the reporting in our episode today. You can read her story on labornotes.org. If you want to read a physical copy or hand them out to your friends, family, and union coworkers, subscribe to our magazine. You can find the links on our website, labornotes.org, and on our Linktree page, linktr.ee/labornotes. And don't miss our upcoming events in March, including the Labor Notes National Call on how federal workers are organizing right now. That'll be on Monday, March 17th at 8 p.m. Eastern. You can help us keep doing this work and build the troublemaking wing of the labor movement by becoming a monthly donor or making a one-time donation at labornotes.org/donate. We're proud to rely on small dollar donations by union members who are building a fighting, multiracial working class movement.
That's our episode today. Until next week, solidarity, y'all.
Welcome to Third and Fairfax. It's the official podcast of the Writers Guild of America West. I'm your host, Brian Gary. SAG-AFTRA's interactive media agreement, which covers video game performers, expired in November of 2022. On July 26, 2024, after 18 months of negotiations with some of the industry's largest video game companies, SAG-AFTRA members called a strike. Today on the podcast, WGA West member and host Miles Warden is joined by SAG-AFTRA Chief Negotiator Duncan Crabtree Ireland and Interactive Media Negotiating Committee Chair Sarah Emale for an update on the strike and to learn more about the core issues that SAG-AFTRA members are fighting for.
What would you say the core issues facing performers in the video games contract are right now that is holding up a fair contract?
Well, it is AI. I mean, that is literally the only issue. I mean, one distinction out from the, your listeners who might have been more familiar with the TV theatrical strike in 2023, there were multiple issues that caused that strike to happen. AI was one of them, and it was a big one, but it wasn't by any means the only one. In this negotiation, Sarah and the negotiating committee and our staff negotiators, we were able to narrow those issues. So really, the only remaining substantive issue is AI. That's what the strike is about. That's what's holding up a deal. And it's the lack of a willingness, frankly, from my point of view, to agree to basic principles of respect and fairness in handling performers' engagement with AI. That is what's holding this whole thing up. And I'll absolutely, of course, defer to Sarah, who brings up a performer perspective to what that's all about and what that feels like.
Yeah, I mean, we across SAG-AFTRA, our position is that the use of this tool can be ethical and properly consenting, kind of a mutual step into the use of this tool to create new, interesting experiences. If certain things are in place, if transparency is in place, if you're forthcoming about the kind of use that you're envisioning for this tool vis-a-vis this actor or performer, and that transparency extends to how you wind up using it, and as well that you're properly compensated for the value that this new expression is built off of, and so those are the kind of tentpole elements of our AI proposal, and then getting into those details is where we've been fighting in the trenches, essentially in the bargaining room for a long time now, and so some of these bigger companies, I think it's not. I don't think it's a stretch for anyone to kind of imagine that these companies see people as just the material that they're printed on, essentially. That they have, then their position is that they have the right to do whatever they want with it. And we as workers understand that our work has value. That as human beings, we need safe working conditions and all these other things that they're ready to blow past and just focus on whatever they make out of you. And so, getting deep into the weeds about what that looks like and what it means is kind of where we've been. I think that's without getting into those weeds. That's the overview.
Well, we are very happy to support you both, and thank you both for coming and giving us all of that great information. Happy to share it along with everybody. And the next picket, I will be on the lines with you guys. It's so great. So we're wishing you all the best in these negotiations.
Hi, everyone. This is John, your host. Today, we're bringing you another one of our Speaking of Work shorts. Before we begin, however, a content warning. This episode deals with suicide. Specifically, it addresses the life and death of a Union railroader, Phil Morgan. Phil was born in 1970 in the little town of Ottawa, Iowa, near the Missouri River, which forms Iowa's western border with Nebraska. After high school, he enlisted in the Navy and served during Operation Desert Storm. In the Navy, he became a welder, and he took that trade back with him to Mapleton, Iowa, a town just about 20 miles from Ottawa, where he settled with his wife, Kara, and their children. As in a lot of rural Iowa towns nowadays, with factories and even schools increasingly few and far between, the railroads and the skilled trades continue to offer some of the best jobs around. Phil recognized this and landed a job as a welder's helper on the Union Pacific Railroad. It's also where he became a Union railroader. Quite a few unions operate on the rails, but the most important one for our story is the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, or BMWED. For anyone who's not familiar with the BMWED, they're the union of workers who build and maintain railroad tracks and the bridges and buildings along those tracks all across the United States and Canada. So, even if you aren't familiar with their union, you've almost certainly seen their work, especially if you live out in a place like rural western Iowa. With the help of his union crew, Phil quickly figured out how to endure the harsh physical stress that went along with working along the rail lines, out of doors, and in all weather conditions. Unfortunately, Phil also had to endure punishing psychological stress, not as a natural consequence of the work itself, but as a form of abuse, meted out by his boss, in this case, his direct supervisor. Despite complaints by his fellow crew members and by the union, the company allowed the abuse to continue. And, over time, it took its toll. On August 18, 2018, Phil took his own life. Over the next several years, Phil's wife, Kara, and their family struggled to turn their grief into a movement to bring justice not only for Phil, but also for all workers who suffer from similar abuse. Their focus, the Federal Employers' Liability, or FELA Act. Think of it as workers' compensation, but for railroad workers. As Kara Morgan discovered, however, FELA has outdated tests that make it very difficult for spouses and families like hers to recover damages from suicide, even when such deaths are directly attributable to conditions created and maintained by a worker's employer. Together with their attorneys in the union, Kara and her family mounted a challenge to the law in the hope that they could win a new legal standard, one that reflected the realities of employer abuse and its impact on workers' mental health and well-being. On February 18, 2025, the Iowa Supreme Court heard the case, and dozens of union railroaders and allies showed up in Des Moines in below-zero temperatures to help bring justice for Phil, his family, and all workers who suffer from workplace mental health abuse.
I'm Ash Anderson with the Brotherhood of Maintenance Way employees, and I am here to stand with a lot of my sisters and brothers as we stand to demand justice for workers like Phil Morgan, whose death was directly attributable to the way he was treated by his supervisor at work. And we want to make sure that the sort of intimidation and retaliation workers like Brother Phil faced just stop on the railroad, and then stop for every worker, because we all deserve quality of life and dignity at work.
Yeah, my name is Joe Nantista. I'm the Assistant General Chairman of the Unified System Division of the Brotherhood of Maintenance Away. The case comes down to the fact that Phil was really bullied by his manager. He was forced to endure a lot of intimidation, a lot of harassment to do pretty much what the manager wanted. And Phil was a veteran. Phil was a valued employee for that company, for Union Pacific Railroad, and this went on for many months. The members on his gang, they took all the proper steps. They brought the attention to the union. They brought this issue to the attention of the union, who got involved. They spoke to that manager. When that manager failed to act, it was brought to that manager's supervisor, which is the process. But the harassment never stopped, and unfortunately it drove Phil to commit suicide. So we're here to bring awareness to the situation. This is stuff that goes on every day on this property on Union Pacific Railroad, especially the intimidation, the arm twisting. So we want to bring some awareness to this situation and this type of harassment that goes on out there. We want the public to know Union Pacific Railroad uses these tactics to get their way with our employees. And of course, we're hoping for a good outcome in this case today. This is a monumental case for the railroad industry and FILA law.
Speaking of Work is an independent production of John McCurley in coordination with the Iowa Labor History Society. The views expressed.
Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. You, like me, probably spend a lot of time these days sort of helplessly ruminating over the sick and freakishly evil qualities of Elon Musk and the rest of the tech oligarchs running the MAGA 2.0 regime. Today, I'm interviewing Brace Belden and Liz Franczak, the hosts of the very smart and hilarious podcast TrueAnon, about just that.
I know, I do think that. I feel like there's something really almost banal about his radicalization, and yet he is sort of such an exceptional figure that he was able to, similar to what he did with Tesla in a lot of ways and with SpaceX as well, somehow manipulate the situation and use it reflexively to his advantage. But it's funny, I think of him as wholly and fully a subject of X, the everything app. There was Elon before COVID and even before 2022, and then now he is just this other thing. And I don't know how else to describe it. I see him as this just human slop machine. Slop, not slot machine, but I guess they're sort of related in some ways. But that he is, Brace, you said like an AI, this recursive loop that, when an AI starts to ingest itself, it's theoretically that leads to collapse. But I don't know if we'll get that lucky with Elon.
Well, he said it. He said, "I am become meme."
Yeah, how fucking disturbing is that? Sorry, swearing, but how disturbing is that? I don't know. I mean, I think that thinking back on him, I think that I keep saying that it's underappreciated, but I actually do really think this is a really basic statement, but bear with me, that I think it's underappreciated how much Twitter, before we're talking about X, has changed politics in this country and then later on in the world. You can compare it a little bit to what talk radio did in the 90s in terms of it inflating or inflating, but like a cyst or something, the kind of civil society. When you think about how people come into a petition, organize, try to speak to or get something from the state. We have, because of the kind of information ecosystem, we have sort of like direct to consumer politics now, right? Where this sort of, all of these social media platforms have cut the cord, as it were, like, or sort of short circuited things, where there's now just like a fucking direct pipeline from someone on a social media website to a politician. Whereas before that, there was a lot of intermediaries, right?
Civic organizations.
Civic organizations, of course. Remember those?
Whether we're talking about Kiwanis Club or labor unions, like either one.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And all of that has now been sort of scuttled into this matrix of social media online. And you see it in, everyone is an avatar, whether it's, the ACLU, or it's Joe Biden, or it's me, or it's a bot in India. Like, and it's all been kind of flattened on this thing, right? And so it's really like anarchic, and but at the same time socially produced and reflexive, but unorganized. And it's also competitive because people are all kind of on there trying to get attention, right? And competing for attention, whether that's jobs or whether that's like social attention in different kind of milieus, whether that's even public facing, or whether that's behind the scenes in group chats where a lot of sort of nascent organizing happens, even if we don't want to call it that, right?
Bryce Belden and Liz Franczak are the hosts of the TrueAnon podcast. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine.
This is Gene Lance on the Workers Beat Extra. I'm going to say something that I know is wrong because it has to be wrong. And yet, at the same time, I know that it's right because it must be right. I've been agonizing over this for a couple of weeks now, and I've been asking everybody I've run into, what do they think? And I haven't gotten a definitive answer. Here's what I think. I think that capitalism, world capitalism, is in its death throes. I think that we have entered the last stage of capitalism. I put this on my blog, genelance.org, which you can read if you want. And I titled it, "'Tis the Final Conflict," because of the song. The song is La Internacional, or The International. And it's got a line in it that says, "'Tis the final conflict." And that's the title of my essay on genelance.org. "'Tis the final conflict, let each stand in their place." Now, I don't know in other languages if they refer to this idea of a final conflict, but I know that they do in Spanish, where they call it the lucha final. Agrupémonos todos en la lucha final. So it seems a little bit funny to be quoting and saying that this is the final conflict and quoting a song that's, 150 years old? But nevertheless, that's what I think, that this is the final conflict. The words to the international are ringing in my ears, and the first days of the Musk-Trump administration are only chaos to most people. I once had the temerity to try to contradict Gus Hall. Gus Hall was a giant among men and a giant among thinkers. He was the chairman of the American Communist Party all the way from the 50s when he was imprisoned, way up until the 1990s, I believe. He was a brilliant man. And he often said socialism is inevitable. Well, I sat in on a meeting with Gus Hall, and I was dumb enough to try to contradict him. And I said, "Gus, socialism is not inevitable." I said, "The other alternative is that they will destroy the world. The ruling class, the bosses, will destroy the world. And he just smiled at me like I was a dumb kid from the farm, which I guess is pretty true. And he said, we don't consider that an alternative. Wasn't a scientific answer. It was simply a humanitarian answer. It was a communist answer. It is not an alternative. It's not a human alternative, destroying the world. And yet, that's where they're heading. I think people are figuring that out, and I think that the working people of America and our many allies will unite and put an end to boss rule. This is Gene Lance on the Workers Beat Extra.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our local UFCW 3000 podcast. I have Kathy McPhail with me. She is a bargainer. We are going to go over all of the details of bargaining and how it works today.
We typically look at bargaining teams and try and pull from our really active members, people who are really actively involved in the union, who understand the contract. And that's not necessarily someone who's been involved for a long period of time. It could be someone who has recently joined the union, but they're really interested in the contract, or they really want to see change happen, or they really want to see something different in the contract. So when we're looking at bargaining teams, and I do this all the time, every week, it seems that we're picking a new bargaining team for a different unit that is going into contract negotiations. So we have to look at their knowledge of the contract, their interest in being knowledgeable about the contract. That's important. I think having someone who has been involved, who's been to Weingarten meetings. I'm not sure if you've talked about Weingarten meetings.
We have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who has been to Weingarten meetings, who understands the idea behind them and representation, and how as a union, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. And so when we pull together a bargaining team, that group is not going to just come to the table and represent the people in their department, but everybody in the bargaining unit. So, in a perfect world, if you have 1,000 people who we're bargaining a contract for, we'd have all 1,000 people at the table, but that's not practical. We have to have a representation of that bargaining unit that fairly represents everybody. But when you come to the bargaining table, as you know, because you've been in bargaining, you represent not just the people in respiratory, you represent everybody in that unit, and you have to speak on their behalf. So it's really important that someone comes in and understands that and know how to do that. And we work with people to try and train them to do that. And another interesting thing is that when we're looking at putting together a bargaining team, it's not just the loudest people or the noisiest people, the people who will gravitate to because they take a leadership position. We want people who work well with other people in a team setting. And that's not always everybody, right? So it's important that you work well in a team, because when we're bargaining contracts, we need to go around the room and discuss things, and we want every voice to count. And as you said, you're talking on behalf of everybody, not just in the bargaining unit, but in the hospital. So it's important that people know how to fit into that team and to make that work.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is a lot of give and take. And how I ended up going into it for the first time, I talked with people and I made a list for my department and other departments of just 4 or 5 things. What are those 4 or 5 things that are important to you that you want changed or addressed in this new contract? And let's put them in level of importance, right? And I was so glad that I did that, because it made it easier when I sat down with everyone else at our table and we started really laying everything out of what we were going to ask for. And yeah, you can go in there and ask for 20, 30 things. But in the bargaining process, you're going to lose some of those things that you wanted, right? So you really do have to list what's the most important and go through that. And there were things that I had to say, you know what, I would love to have this for this new contract, but let's keep it for next contract. We'll keep it in the books. But for right now, that person's problem is more important. That department's issue is more important. And I want to fight for that, because that's going to have a larger positive impact on my coworkers rather than this one thing for a few people. To our listeners, if you guys have any questions or concerns, you can always go to ufcw3000.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, and everyone have a fabulous day.
For we are coming, union Welcome to another edition of On the Line, a podcast that dives into the past for rich, relevant stories from BC's labour history. I'm your host, Rod Mickelborough. It's been 35 years since that dramatic February day in 1990 when Nelson Mandela walked out of prison and set South Africa on a course to end apartheid and establish majority rule. The fight against apartheid was long, arduous, and often violent, costing many, many lives. But it could not have been won without the solidarity of anti-apartheid groups around the world. In this episode of On the Line, we celebrate the anniversary of Nelson Mandela's release with a look back at the contribution of BC unions and local labor activists. In an interview by SAC-AFTRA Solidarity alumni several years ago, activist Jeff Keithley recounted his introduction to the anti-apartheid cause as an overseas volunteer for CUSO and later as a trade unionist with the Canadian Association of Industrial, Mechanical and Allied Workers, known as CAMA.
So basically, I got involved with the Southern Africa anti-apartheid movement before I joined the trade union movement, but because there was so much activity in and around the Vancouver District Labour Council, being a very progressive group, that gave us connections between the citizen activists and labor activists. And so it became like a seamless whole, so that we're all working on the same thing together. And then through the SAC group, we were organizing a whole series of shop-ins. We would basically organize 30, 40 people to go to the supermarket and with an identified list of South African products, load up their shopping carts with South African products, and then head off. You fill it right up. And then you head off to the cash register, and somebody at the front of the line would say, "What?" They'd pick up a can. This product is for the cashier. This product's from South Africa, isn't it? Well, yes, it is. Well, it looks like all of this is from South Africa. And then somebody would shout, "Have you checked your shopping carts? A lot of this stuff is from South Africa." And people would say, "Oh my God, this is terrible." And everybody walk out leaving 30, 40 shopping carts filled to the brim.
Tremendous.
All South African products. And it would take hours and hours for the store to have to pay their staff to put it back on the shelf. And you just kept this up. And eventually some of the stores said, "Look, this is just too much trouble." And so they would start backing off on that.
Colleen Jordan, who spent 15 years as Secretary-Treasurer of QPBC, was another activist involved in the fight. She was interviewed by Keith Reynolds for the BC Labour Heritage Centre's Oral History Project.
So we took a letter to the Burmese School Board and said, and of course the Burmese School Board said, well, like, what kind of goods from South Africa are we ever going to be using? Okay, no problem, right? Pass a motion. Burmese School Board will not use goods manufactured in South Africa. So 7:30 in the morning one day, a couple of months later, my phone rings and it's the maintenance director at the school district. He said, "Colleen, the grounds guys will not go to work." I said, "What the heck's going on?" He said, "They say you said they're not supposed to touch stuff from South Africa. And we have chicken wire that they're supposed to put up around the grass, right? And it says made in South Africa, and they say they're not touching it." I said, "Yep, that's right." And the school board, Mr. Maintenance Supervisor, has a policy that the school board will not have goods from South Africa. He said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" And I said, "Well, you better go get some chicken wire that's not made in South Africa because we're not touching it." Your employer, the Burmese School Board, has said they will not handle goods from South Africa. So, okay. So, amazing. It worked. It really worked.
We hope you've appreciated our look back at a time when unions around the world, including here in BC, took a stand in support of racial equality and justice, not in their own backyard, but on behalf of people thousands of miles away in South Africa. It was international solidarity at its most inspiring.
Hey, that's a wrap for this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, our roundup of some of the programs aired over the last week on more than 200 labor radio and podcast shows. They are all part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, shows that focus on working people's issues and concerns, and frankly, they're needed now more than ever. We've got links to all the network shows, laborradionetwork.org. You can also find them. Use the hashtag LaborRadioPod on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Don't forget, let us know what you think of this show. Drop us a note, info@laborradionetwork.org. You can be part of the network. You don't even need a microphone. Labor Radio Podcast Network t-shirts are available. They're union made. You'll find them in all sizes and 2 colors at laborradionetwork.org. This podcast is recorded under a SAG-AFTRA collective bargaining agreement. The Labor Radio Podcast Weekly was edited this week by Captain Swing. I produced the show, and our social media guru, always and forever, is Mr. Harold Phillips. For the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, this has been Chris Garlock. Stay active and stay tuned to your local Labor Radio Podcast show. We will see you next week.